Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the blockchain lecture of the Emerging Technology Adoption and Use course. So today is our first guest lecture of the course setting. We will have a few more focused more on virtual reality and artificial intelligence. So we're very happy to introduce Keir Finlow-Bates, who's an inventor and entrepreneur and does quite a bit in blockchain related aspect. So maybe I'll just let Keir, you introduce yourself and tell what we're going to do in this particular lecture, and we'll take a more sidestander role. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm Dr. Keir Finlow-Bates. I get to use the doctor because I'm in a university normally. I got a PhD in mathematics and education from London Southbank University and a master's in mathematics and information engineering from the University of Cambridge. Most of my time these days is spent on inventing and patenting, and I think at the moment it's actually gone up since that number, so I'm now to 35 patents and 10 blockchain patents. So I've been looking at blockchain since about 2010. Unfortunately, I didn't buy lots of Bitcoins. I looked at the code instead. So that's why I'm still working. But it's been a good technology. I've enjoyed looking into it, and I'm looking forward to many more years of investigating blockchain because it's the invention that keeps giving. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll have a lecture about 40 minutes or so, 45 maybe, where I'll be touching a whole bunch of topics within blockchain. If you have a question, feel free to ask me. This isn't some kind of formal presentation with a script that I'm going to follow religiously. So if you want to ask anything, just put your hand up and we can take questions at any time. And then for the second half, we have some workshop topics, which will be up on the screen, and you can form into groups and start having discussions on those, and we'll circulate and see how you guys are doing. Okay. So I'm going to start off with a question, which is, what do you think the three greatest inventions in human history are? Maybe take a moment to think about that. I'll give you a clue. It's not the light bulb, as far as I'm concerned. Any thoughts? Anyone want to hazard it? Yeah? The wheel. Yep, that's often quoted as a popular one. Anybody else got no? Electricity. Yeah, these are all fantastic inventions. What I'm going to do in today's course is I'm going to be giving you a bit of history on human development of things to do with economics. And we'll be touching on some of the inventions that I think are probably the greatest ones. And you'll probably be surprised because they're actually quite simple. They've been around for so long that we don't really think of them as that special anymore. But maybe by the end of this lecture I'll have convinced you that what I personally think are some of the greatest inventions are things that you would have overlooked, but at the end you'll think, oh, maybe he's got a point there. So we'll see. Firstly, though, I said it's a course on blockchain, or a lecture on blockchain, and then we should really get to grips with blockchain. And by the way, blockchain is not yet one of the three greatest inventions in human history. And I don't know, maybe it never will be, but what problem does blockchain solve? And the problem that blockchain solves, very simply put, is the double spend problem. So the double spend problem is one that we don't have when you're using things like £50 notes in the United Kingdom or 10 euro notes in Finland or 50 euro notes. When you have a physical banknote, some money, and you go into a shop and you hand it over and you take some goods in return, it's guaranteed that you no longer own that banknote, and the shopkeeper now does. So it's a problem that we don't really think about in everyday life. But when you move over into the digital world, suddenly we have a problem in that, firstly, in the digital world, it's really, really easy to make copies of stuff. And secondly, in the digital world, it's really easy to rewrite history. So, for example, if I have an MP3 file with some music on it, I can make 100,000 copies and email them out to 100,000 people, and everybody has the same thing. You can't do that with a CD or with a record or with a banknote. And the second thing is that if we're recording data on a computer or on the internet, there's nothing that says I can't go in if I have administrator rights and go back and change history. So I can go in and edit it, and whereas it may say that I am the author of an academic paper and here's a digital copy of the paper, someone with suitable skills can go in and change it to their name and maybe change the date on it and stuff like that. So we have this problem in the digital world that it's not as material as the material world. And that's the core of the problem that blockchain is trying to solve. And one way I put this is that it's about ownership. So when it comes down to it, when you have digital stuff, the only way you can prove ownership of it at the moment is through the courts. It's like, this is my digital document, I own it, I have the copyright, you should not have a copy, and the court says, right, you have to delete it off your servers. But blockchain actually does allow people to own stuff. And I think that's quite a significant thing. That's why it's a breakthrough. So at the moment, if we're going to, for example, digital payments rather than using cash, we use a middleman or a broker or some third party that we trust. So if I want to send you some money, I'll do it through my bank, or I'll use a credit card or a debit card, and we're trusting Visa or MasterCard or Nordea or PayPal or whoever to keep an accurate record of our balances, so that Visa makes sure that if I spend 100 euros, my bank balance goes down, and the person who I spend it on, their bank balance goes up. And we pay quite a hefty fee for that. Now, do any of you know what the standard charge for a credit card company is to a shop? Any ideas? Well, if you go in and buy 100 euros worth of goods with cash, then the shopkeeper gets all of it. If you buy it with a credit card, 2.5% or thereabouts goes to the credit card company. And shops run on really narrow margins, so that's actually quite a significant amount for them to have to pay. And, but they accept credit and debit cards because it's better to have people spending money on you than not. So that's the current solution. So why is blockchain different? Well, with the current banking systems, you have a central authority. They have a database where they keep track of all these balances, and they update it regularly as the transactions come in. Blockchain isn't centralized. So this is actually a diagram. It was drawn by a guy called Paul Baran in 1964, and it was one of the first distributed and decentralized computing diagrams that cropped up. It was actually this one's from a paper that he wrote, which was actually about producing computer networks that the military could have and would survive in case particular areas were attacked. So the military was very interested in decentralization, because it's no good if you have your base that is controlling everything if it gets bombed and now everybody's without leaders. So they were looking at a distributed or decentralized system. And there is a distinction between decentralized and distributed. So decentralized, you still have these hubs, but you don't have one hub anymore. Whereas distributed, there's this the network is completely peer-to-peer. And as it turns out, blockchain falls somewhere between decentralized and distributed, depending on which blockchain you're looking at and the participants. But the aim generally is to move more and more towards C, distributed. Any questions on this so far? So that's the big difference between our current solutions for handling transactions in the digital world with a centralized authority versus a decentralized system that blockchain uses. So maybe I should make a point here, which is I'm not going to be digging into the technical stuff too much. I don't want to be explaining to you complicated cryptographic algorithms or how you would code up a blockchain yourself. Here we're looking more at what blockchains can do, because you're looking at applications rather than actually building them. And so I have an analogy with this, which is, imagine that the car had just been invented, and everyone's familiar with horse and cart. You'd have people getting up and start talking about what this amazing new car is, and they'd be talking about solenoids and alternators and carburetors and stuff like that. You don't need to know what those are. in order to be able to drive a car. What you do need to know is where a car is relevant and why a car might, in some circumstances, be more useful than a horse and cart. And similarly, you have an analogy there that a horse and cart and a car are quite similar, but a car has some advantages. For example, you don't need to feed it every day. You can put it in a garage and leave it for 3 months, and as long as it's well enough built, you can start it up again 3 months later. But horses take a lot of care. Similarly, cars are more powerful, so you could start building business cases and say, well, if I know how horse and cart works and I have a business that uses one, how could I expand my business if I moved to cars? With the caveat that, of course, at the point that cars first came along, they had a lot of potential, but they weren't very reliable. And it was only some people who had sort of a vision of what these things might be like in the future that pushed the invention along. A lot of people were quite happy to stick with horse and cart. And so now I'm going to come up with an analogy that I hope will help you with blockchain, and that is Google Sheets. Any of you used Google Sheets? Yeah? Yeah, so it's a spreadsheet, and a spreadsheet is actually a kind of database. Happens to be really good for running lots of multiple calculations on. And Google Sheets is a distributed spreadsheet. So you can go and share it with all your friends, and you can all go in and edit it together. And you can think of a blockchain as something like Google Sheets, where you're keeping a record of transactions. The transactions may be of some kind of token or replacement for money, or it could be transactions that contain data. It can contain what you like, but it's transaction focused. So you're going to have these kind of rows in the spreadsheet. And the fact is that anybody can go in and read it, and anybody can go in and write to it. However, does anybody see a problem with this if that's how we try to keep track of who owned how much of a particular currency? Nope. Maybe if I call up this. So this is actually a copy of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, a manuscript of a poem he wrote, and these are all his changes and alterations. Now, it's all very well if one guy is making changes and alterations to his own particular poem. If we have a database or a spreadsheet that anybody can access, and we're keeping track of how much cash I have and how much cash Henry has, I can go in and change it. And that could be quite handy, because at the moment I'm not a multimillionaire, but if that's how we're all keeping track of our finances, I can just go in and add a few zeros on the end of my balance, and now suddenly I'm rich. So that's not really going to work out very well if that's how we're going to try and keep track of our respective wealth or our respective ownership of things. So it goes back to the thing I mentioned earlier, that there's this problem in the digital world that you can go in and edit stuff. Okay. So actually, maybe I should talk a little bit more about that. So when you have this shared Google Sheets thing, what we have to do is we have to set it up in such a way that not just anybody can go in and change anything. There need to be a whole bunch of rules that allow you, under certain circumstances, to make changes. We need to ensure that you can't go back and change the history, edit time. So there is this thing called a time-stamped hash-linked list in cryptography that allows you to make sure that when a record's added and more records are added, you can't go and change the earlier ones because they're all sort of linked together. And the third thing we're really concerned about with having a transactional database is that we need to have a concept of identity. If I'm going to own something and I'm going to give it to you, and it's done in a digital way, then we have to have digital identities, one that clearly identifies me and one that clearly identifies you. And in fact, in blockchain, we use digital signing. So I have a private key, and that allows me to sign things that prove that I am me, and therefore I'm authorized to perform a transaction. And similarly, you have an identity, so that when I submit a transaction and I say I'm transferring something from me to you, it's clear that it's coming from me, and it's clear that it's going to you. And in blockchain, they use what is called asymmetric key cryptography. You have a public key, which is like your bank account number, and you have a private key, which is a bit like your PIN code that only you have, so only you can authorize transactions. So What is a transaction? I've used that word quite a bit. Anybody want to have a go at defining what a transaction might be? Come on, guys, a little bit of enthusiasm. Yeah? Exchange of something valuable. Yeah, and it's as simple as that. I wrote down here, where was it? Yeah, transfer of ownership from one entity to another. Either physical objects or a record of the transaction is needed. So a transaction, it may not involve something real and physical. For example, I could give someone 100 euros and they could fix my car. Basically the transaction involves money for labor. I might swap a copy of a rare comic book that I have for an old game console or something like that, and then when it's not involving money anymore, but generally there's something going in one direction and something coming back in the other direction. Or it could be a one-way transaction, which is something going from one person to another. For example, when I give one of my kids pocket money, I don't get anything in return, but it's still a transaction. Okay, so I'm going to move on to what I think is possibly the greatest invention in humanity. It's had a lot of problems, but I think it's also one of the things that has allowed us to subsequently do all sorts of other greater things. So it's a foundational invention. You see, I think the greatest inventions are ones on which you can build stuff, or the ones that enable us to build stuff. So the wheel's very useful, and actually, it's funny you mentioned it because I was looking in my kitchen the other day. I think there's about 20 wheels in my kitchen, none of which actually moved things from one place to another, but they were going round. But I think money is actually a more significant one because it's what's provided well, I'll talk about it a bit more. So this one probably looks recognizably like money to all of you. Those are Roman coins. This one Finnish people will recognize this as a form of money. There's a squirrel skin, and Finland used to use them as a form of money. In fact, the Finnish word for money, raha, is derived from the Finnish word for squirrel, orava. So then on the left there we have a wampum shell, which were used in North America as money. And anybody know what these things in the middle are? These are Polynesian yap stones. There are tribes in Polynesia who use these gigantic stones carved into these wheel shapes as money. They also had smaller ones, which were easier to carry around and useful, therefore, for buying a chicken or an axe or something like that. But the big ones were for owning really, really big, important things. And they were so heavy that the tribes didn't generally move them around very much. And some of them even ended up in the bottom of lakes and stuff like that. But they still had a clearly defined owner. And it turns out that what the tribes did was they made songs about who owned the yap stone, a particular yap stone at a particular time. And then if the ownership transferred, say a chief gave 10 huts in his village in order to receive the yap stone, instead of physically moving the yap stone to his hut, they just added another few lines to the song, saying that now he owned it. And then the song sort of became a story about successive ownership of these stones. This is actually real stuff. So, and actually that song that grew over time is kind of a blockchain, because you're actually keeping track of a physical object through an abstract object. And this is a keeping with money. It's an abstraction. And the reason why it's useful is a fundamental problem if you're going to trade stuff. If I happen to have a lot of potatoes and you have a lot of chickens, and I want to have a chicken, I can trade them, my potatoes with you. But what if you don't want potatoes? Well, maybe I trade my potatoes for some guy who has bread, because you want bread, and then I give the bread to you, so that's a pain in the neck. And what's more, we need to have this n by n matrix of prices. If my village has, say, 1,000 things in it that people like to own, like eggs and chickens and bread and plates and things like that, you have to carry around in your head 1,000 by 1,000 matrix. How much is a potato worth compared to an egg? How much is a chicken worth compared to a plate? That n by n matrix, that's a big deal. That's a lot of information. If you have money, you collapse the matrix down into an n by 2 matrix. So now we can just price each item in terms of how many squirrel skins it is worth. And suddenly your price list becomes a lot shorter. So that's one of the great uses of money. I'm probably going on about money too long, and it's not something that I mean, like everybody, I like having it. But it's an abstraction. And, right, yes, let's see. So then there's a second thing we need to consider, which is what makes something valuable. And here I've got an example. We've got this metal on the left called gold. It's got a density of about 19. And we consider it to be very, very valuable. A kilo of that at the moment is worth about 40,000 euros. On the right is a bar of tungsten. It also has a density of around about 19. It weighs almost exactly the same as gold. And I was actually hoping to bring a little cube of it along to show you, but it didn't arrive in time. The thing is, the bar on the right is only worth 200 euros. And the reason for that is we don't use tungsten as a store of value. And this is quite an amazing concept, the idea that you can take something that's valuable or something that isn't valuable, rather, and then say, well, actually, we're all going to agree that it is valuable because it will have some use for us. And the reason why it's useful to have things that store this abstract concept of value, it goes back to the money thing again. So money's good for trading, but then there's a second aspect of value. And historically, there's been a problem with money, which is that you want to encourage people to spend it. And you don't want them to hide it under their bed and dig it out sort of 10, 20 years later. So we have money for transactions, and then we have things like gold for value. Now, the reason why I'm going on about this stuff is because the main use case for blockchain at the moment has been for cryptocurrencies. Now, some of those advances have been great. There's also been a lot of problems, as is always the case when you have money involved. People are looking for ways of scamming or getting an advantage. But it's mainly down to the fact that the origins of blockchain came from the 2008 banking crisis, where we had serious economic problems, and a lot of money was pumped into the economy by central banks in order to recover from the mistakes the banks had made. And this guy called Satoshi Nakamoto, or woman, we don't know who it is, invented blockchain as a kind of replacement for our economic system. But I'm going to move on soon to some of the other applications that blockchain can have too. But the thing is, you have to remember its history, which is it was put forward as a replacement for money. It's actually now become a store of value. We don't know what it will evolve to in the future. And it's a sort of progression historically from what's going on here. Okay. Any questions so far? So here's what I think is invention number 2, which is accounting. And this is a Sumerian clay tablet back about 5000 BC or thereabouts. The Sumerians in, I think it's now Iraq, basically, used to keep track of stuff using these clay tablets. It was the first accounting system, and it's single entry accounting. You wrote down the name of somebody and how much they owned. So, for example, they were storing grain. Farmers would farm grain, bring bags of grain to a silo, and they'd all store their grain in the same silo, and they would keep track of how many bags of grain a particular farmer had contributed on clay tablets. And then if the farmer came along and took some of the grain back, they keep track of that. But it's just single entry. The name of the owner, how much they contributed, and then later on, name of the owner, how much they withdrew. And again, it seems kind of trivial now to keep a list of who owns what. Right? Like if you're in a shared house, and you go write down a list of, right, well, the cutlery belonged to me, and you bought the plates and stuff like that. But it was a major advance in human development. But it has a problem. It's really easy to commit fraud, because you just wipe out a line, and suddenly a particular farmer's ownership of something is gone. So I'll try and rattle along a bit further there. So what accounting does is abstracts, again, it's another abstraction of value. So, and this is one of the things maybe when we start doing the workshops you want to think about is blockchain is yet another level on top of this abstraction. So you've got this first use case, Bitcoin, which was meant to be money and then became a kind of digital gold. But there are lots of other things that are abstract that can be represented on a blockchain in a kind of a token manner or through transactional records. And I've got a list here of some that I came up with off the top of my head. So shares in companies, digital tokens for local economies, reward points, loyalty points, casino chips, game currencies for computer games, like V-Bucks, but instead of being V-Bucks that only work in Fortnite, they also work in other games. So these are some of the things in the second half of this session that you may want to be thinking about. Okay. So here's number 3, and this one came along in the 1400s, and it's double entry accounting. So we're now moving 6,000 years on. We've been stuck in the Middle Ages for a long, long time, and double entry accounting is one of the things, together with the limited liability company, in fact, that allowed Italy to move out of the Dark Ages and into the Enlightenment. And it's probably kind of the kickoff of what subsequently became the Industrial Revolution, and then what we now have is, I guess, the Information Revolution. And do any of you know how double entry accounting works? Anybody done any double entry accounting bookkeeping? Right. Any of you got any idea what it actually is? Yeah, kind of? Yeah. Every company in Finland has to have its accounts done using double entry accounting. You don't do that, you get prosecuted and fined by the government. It's a legal requirement in pretty much every country that a company has its accounts done using double entry accounting. And there's a good reason for this. I'll get onto that here. So this is that double entry accounting prevents fraud and it prevents error. And in double entry accounting, whenever you add a number to an account sheet, you have to subtract it from another one. You've heard of the term balancing the books? Yeah? In double entry accounting, you have to balance the books. Everything ultimately has to total up to 0. So if you look at company 1 there, when you have an account sheet that says that, say, they spent 10,000 euros on a fleet of vans, their cash amount has to go down by 10,000 euros, and then some other accounting sheet for the company of assets has to increase by the equivalent amount. So it's like the cash went down by 10,000 euros, and the assets went up by 10,000 euros because we now own a 10,000 euro van. But the problem with double entry accounting is that if it doesn't balance, if all the numbers don't add up to 0, that means that either one of two things has happened. Either there has been fraud, or there's been an accounting error. But in double entry accounting, you can't tell which. And so when you come to balance the books and they don't balance, and this is considered a really, really serious thing. And actually, here's a fact for you. There are 10 times as many accountants in the United Kingdom as there are doctors. So obviously, we consider accountants to be 10 times more important than doctors, given that we have so many of them. So it's a big profession, a lot of money spent on it. I know that my company spends about 5% of its revenue on paying accountants. It's not cheap. And we do it to avoid fraud. So, but there's this flaw. Now, triple entry accounting is an idea whereby instead of having silos for each company with their own double entry accounts, you start linking them together, because that then allows you to determine whether it's fraud or whether it's an accounting error when something goes wrong with the books. And this is basically linking transactions to transactions. So when I do the accounts for my company and I say I've spent 5,000 euros on computer equipment, I just say 5,000 euros gone, 5,000 euros worth of computer equipment now owned. And Verkkokauppa is doing a similar thing, because normally I buy my computer from them. They say that they received 5,000 euros and 5,000 euros worth of computer stock went out of their warehouse. But there's no link between these two things. And if something goes wrong with my company, accountants have to start digging in, and auditors have to start digging in where the transactions went wrong. But with triple entry accounting, whenever any company has a transaction, there's another company that receives it, the two are linked And a blockchain is perfect for that. So this is why I think this may actually be the next big invention, because accounting and money inventions don't come along very often. You know, we're looking at 8,000 years ago for single entry. Maybe money came along, I don't know, 10, 15,000 years ago. And then 700 years ago, 600 years ago, double entry accounting came along. So, you know, that's, what, 20 generations, 30 generations. So new accounting invention comes along every 30 generations. And blockchain may well be the next one. Okay, this leads me on to one of the proposed use cases for blockchain, and that is supply chain. Because supply chain is very much like these financial transactions we're talking about. In fact, it is. It's just that there are lots and lots of parties. And there's a problem at the moment in supply chain in that a farm produces a bunch of eggs. The eggs get bought by a company that makes cakes, and they also buy some flour and some butter and stuff like that, and they make some cakes, and they package them, and then they ship them to a supermarket, and the supermarket ships them to you, and you eat one and you get ill. And now we have to work out, where did this go wrong? And let's say it turned out that the eggs were bad, but it could have been something else. In supply chain, it's an absolute nightmare to back trace what went wrong. And what's more, supply chain, there's this thing called the grey supply chain, where you have knockoffs and fakes and inauthentic stuff. There's problems with goods not matching the spec that is claimed for them. And the supply chain is a crazy network of transactions between many, many different parties. And then you have all the logistics on top of it, on shipping stuff from place to place to place. It's amazing it actually works, that you can actually buy some goods that are manufactured in China and have them arrive at your doorstep here in Finland in a matter of days. So when you look at it as a transactional problem, there's an issue, which is that companies generally don't want to open up their data. They don't, you know, nobody wants to take responsibility for running the one big supply chain database, because nobody uses the same standards, and nobody wants to say allow all the other parties to look into their databases. So how you go, and yet somehow all these things are supposed to interoperate, and they only interoperate on a kind of pair-by-pair basis. And as a result, for example, if you look at the container industry, shipping industry, they have these things called waybills or manifests, where they have paper documentation and needs to be signed for customs and needs to be signed for goods being received and stuff like that. If you have a container traveling from New York to, say, Frankfurt via the port of Rotterdam, by the time it arrives at Frankfurt, you've got this stack of paper which various people have signed along the way. So that's the kind of thing where people, for example, IBM with the TradeLens blockchain and Maersk, the shipping company, are looking to replace this system, which does look like it comes from the early 80s, with something that hopefully will be a lot more efficient, a lot more easy to search through records if something goes wrong, and that will encourage better interoperability and reduce fraud and fakes. So, let's see. Next one, identity. Anybody know why I put this picture up? Any of you guys recognize these people? No? I'm dating myself here, aren't I? No, that's the British rock band The Who. And they had a song called Who Are You as well. So I thought I would chuck them in there because, of course, that's something to do with identity. So I was talking earlier about how in order to have a transaction on a digital system, I need to have a clear identity and you need to have a clear identity. Identity is a big, hot topic at the moment. The governments are particularly interested in it to make sure that people get the benefits that they are allowed to have, and that, I mean, there is an element of controlling the population, but there's also an element of ensuring that people within a particular country get the things that they're entitled to, and that people who are not entitled to them don't get them. So one of the things that has been proposed with blockchain is that it be used for improving the way that we handle identity, and I particularly think that it has the opportunity to give us self-owned identity. If you look at the way that the Nordic countries handle identity, the government's outsourced it to the banks. You have to have a bank account. The bank does checks that you are who you are, make sure that they've seen your passport, your driving license, they have your address, and then you get one of these code apps. Or remember they used to have the little paper cards where you scrubbed out a number each time. And then you can use that to identify yourself to the tax authorities or to the incomes register or to Kela or things like that. But it puts the banks in control of your identity. Now, that's okay if you're in Finland for now because everybody's legally entitled to a bank account. This is the trade-off that's been made. The government said banks can handle identity, but you must give every person living in Finland a bank account. That's not the case in a lot of the rest of the world. There are plenty of unbanked people, so using banks for identity is not going to work as a global identifier. And there are plenty of countries where banks can just decide on a whim that they're going to close your bank account. You're not going to be banking with them anymore. And if your identity was tied up in your bank account, you've just lost your identity. That could cause you serious troubles. So the idea with blockchain is, again, your identity can live on this shared, decentralized database or spreadsheet, and you're in control of it because you have the private keys to your identity. And that effectively means that you own your identity. And now there's all sorts of initiatives. Hyperledger Indy is one that I can think of off the top of my head, of building systems whereby identity can be handled by the individual rather than requiring a central authority. And I see this as a positive thing because of this preventing the arbitrary loss of identity. And it's something that we here in general have not had to worry about. But there are plenty of people who have found that their country suddenly no longer exists and they're having to flee and they're refugees. They have no paperwork to prove who they are. But they often have a mobile phone. So if identity could live on a blockchain, then they would be in less trouble. Okay. Yes?
How about the question that relates to, for example, passport recovery? So there should be some kind of level of hierarchy.
Yeah. Actually, I will be coming on to that in slide 21, weaknesses.
Okay.
That's a good question. So a third thing I thought I would raise with you is the idea of IoT and blockchain. So it seems kind of blindingly obvious to us now, but the idea of having network-connected devices that can report information back to various parties and receive control messages isn't actually that old. It's only fairly recently that this stuff is really taking off. And the UK, for example, still hasn't switched en masse to digital IoT smart meters for electricity metering. So we've got a world that is slowly but surely getting more and more connected with lots and lots of semi-autonomous devices scattered around, taking all sorts of readings and measurements of what's going on in our environment, reporting information back, possibly controlling stuff. It's not just about deciding what particular color purple you want your light bulb to look like. I mean, this is immensely important to industry. But we have two issues really with IoT, which is about identity of the devices. And if you go and follow the news, you'll see that IoT devices are getting hacked all the time. Even something like your Wi-Fi router at home is kind of an IoT device now. And unfortunately, security tends to be the thing that companies cut first when they're trying to save money. That's why you can buy these devices and they come with username admin, password admin as default. But blockchain could bring identity for IoT devices. That's the way I would summarize it. And similarly, you could authorize individuals or other devices to access particular IoT devices. So there's your access management thing. And then actually there's an even bigger one, which is at the moment we're seeing lots of walled ecosystems for IoT arriving. There's a lot of big companies, just off the top of my head again, like Google or Cisco, Microsoft. Even Bosch, the white goods manufacturer, is looking to build an IoT cloud infrastructure. They don't interoperate, and that means you buy a device, and then you can't use it on another IoT system. And if one of these companies decides we're not going to run it anymore, suddenly you have a house full of connected devices that are no longer connected. So another advantage that blockchain could bring to IoT is the idea of your device has an identity and you can move it from different infrastructure to different infrastructure. It's kind of a problem we're facing at the moment. That, as a company, you decide, am I going to go with Amazon for the cloud solution, or am I going to go with Microsoft or Google? And then you're locked in. It's really hard to get out again. The cost of moving is expensive. So there's a potential here for blockchain to reduce the cost or even eliminate the cost of moving your IoT solution from one provider to another, which should ultimately be good for us as consumers. So that was the IoT ideas. So yeah, here we are, weaknesses. So I'll cover the picture of the tree with the poster on it, which is your password question. When you don't have a central authority, that means you haven't got an admin that you can email to say, I forgot my password again, can you please reset it? And then you get an email back saying, all right, here it is. Change it as soon as you log in. So we are going to need different systems in order to allow private key recovery, which is very similar to password recovery. And people have proposed numerous ideas. There's things like relying on biometrics. Biometrics always makes me a little bit edgy ever since I read the article about the guy who had his thumb cut off in Thailand so that the thieves could steal his thumb lock-activated BMW. The other problem with biometrics is that you're kind of stuck with them for life. So, you may change your username and password on a system, but you can't change your iris or your eyeball or your retina. And similarly, if these systems are not well designed and are compromised, again, you can't change your eyeball if you're stuck with the biometric data you have. So we have to make absolutely sure that it can't be compromised or stolen. So there are a whole bunch of effectively lost password issues with blockchain that are still being worked on. It's tricky, but at least the problem is now identified, and that's identifying the problem is usually half the effort of getting to a solution. So I had a cracked mirror on the left. That's to represent irreversibility of transactions. So in a public open blockchain, when you submit a transaction, it's submitted. If you accidentally send your cryptocurrency or your tokens to the wrong person, the only way you're going to get them back is if that person returns them to you because you asked them nicely. Now, in banking, we have an advantage in that you can cancel a transaction after you've submitted it if it was made in error. There are things, for example, chargebacks, where if you pay for something with a credit card and you change your mind, you can get your money back. You don't have that guarantee at the moment in blockchain. But again, it's something that people are working on. In fact, I've got a couple of patents related to how can we allow a certain level of reversibility to transactions. So there are solutions, technical solutions that are being proposed. But for now, once it's written down there, it's there. Then there's the worry about energy consumption of blockchains. I'm sure you've read articles about how Bitcoin is now burning as much energy as a sort of small country, or actually not even that small a country. I think they're up to Ireland now. Is it Morocco? Right, okay. So that's disturbing. And this is, by the way, for a public open blockchain. This is one for a blockchain where anybody can join anywhere in the world. There are these things called permissioned blockchains, and they can use a different system that is not energy intensive. But you lose some of the openness and freedom of the blockchain. So it's a trade-off. The thing I always raise with the energy consumption is that, yes, Bitcoin does consume a disturbing amount of energy, and I'm not personally happy about it, but go have a look at the gold mining industry. How much energy we have spent on digging up this yellow metal, and what kind of pollution gold mining causes to the environment. It's really, really damaging to the environment. And gold at the moment is our big method for storing value, like I was talking about earlier when I showed you the pictures of the bars. It's useful to be able to store value. That's why we have the things like the gold industry. And there's a high cost associated with storing value. And when you think about it, it's crazy that we spend a fortune digging a yellow metal up, melting it into bars, and what do we do with them when we have all the bars? We put them back in the ground again, and we have a security guard to make sure nobody steals them. So the industry of storing value is an odd one, and it is a damaging one to the environment. So it's not surprising that things like Bitcoin are causing damage to the environment by burning a lot of energy too. But again, something we can work on. And why did I put a picture of a man in a Guy Fawkes mask? Oh yes, anonymity and pseudo-anonymity, and knowing your customer and anti-money laundering rules. So one of the problems as far as governments are concerned is that the rise of blockchains and digital currencies that are open and independent of any organization, and in particular that have certain privacy aspects where you can't know who owns the particular amount of the currency, of course opens up all sorts of possibilities for criminal activity. Criminals liked dollar bills because you can put them in a suitcase and hand them over to another criminal, and the government can't track that transaction. Governments are looking to track our transactions more because that reduces things like fraud and crime. And now with blockchains, just as they kind of thought that they were moving us all towards the point that you have to use cards or your mobile phone to pay with things, and as a result there's a record of every transaction tied directly to who you are, suddenly along come these cryptocurrencies, and all the good work, quote, is getting undone. There are, of course, plenty of people who say that privacy is really, really important, and some crime is maybe a price that we have to accept in order to actually have privacy in our lives and not have everybody know everything about us. Now, I know I'm in the wrong country here for that, because I was quite shocked when I came here and found out that everybody's tax records are freely available online. To an American or an English person, that seems just insane. But you guys seem actually fairly rational, so maybe it's the Anglo-American bloc that's wrong on that account. Anyway, it's a complicated one. However, it does actually lead me on to the last slide before we start tackling some workshop stuff, which is censorship resistance. So in a centralized system, you have a problem, which is if you're, for example, using your bank and you want to pay for something with your bank card, the bank has the power to annul that transaction, say, no, we're not going to accept it. Now, you probably don't ever hit that problem because you're going into S-Market and buying a bag of potatoes, or you're going into a bar and buying a beer or something like that, and generally banks don't block those kind of activities. But, for example, there were some people in America recently who wanted to go and buy a cryptocurrency with their credit card and found they couldn't. And that is a form of censorship. The bank is saying, we are the central party in control of this. We are not going to allow you to use your bank account, your in quotes, and your money, your in quotes again, to buy this thing that you want to buy, because we are against it. Now, I'm not saying it's a particularly extreme form of censorship. I mean, I'm certainly not comparing some guy in Seattle feeling really sad because he couldn't buy Litecoin with his credit card to stuff that people have suffered throughout history in terms of censorship. But it's an issue, and it actually knocks, there's a sort of further knock-on effect. Now, I run a blockchain company. I don't actually deal with cryptocurrencies. Facebook wouldn't allow me to advertise my company on their site because they said blockchain equals cryptocurrencies equals scam. We don't allow that. Facebook is a central authority. I may have an identity on the Facebook system, but they can just decide on a whim that, no, we're not going to let you advertise. We're not going to, in fact, we're going to close your account. You know, you could wake up tomorrow and find you have no more Facebook account. Sorry, you have a question? Yeah, and actually some people are saying that's why they were banning cryptocurrency adverts. That they announced back in September this idea for a digital currency called Libra, which all Facebook account holders would have access to, and it was going to be what's called a stable coin. There was going to be real cash backing up the coins. Effectively, they were looking to move into payments and remittances, the PayPal space, through Facebook. But they also wanted to get a lot of the other big companies like MasterCard and Visa and banks and stuff like that on board. So they thought they would launch it as a blockchain so that there wasn't it wasn't just Facebook being completely in control. And I would guess that they judged that they had the user base. So they were going to be pretty powerful anyway, but they needed support from the traditional financial institutions to push it through. And actually, as it turns out, they're right, because it's kind of on a hiatus now as the US government investigates whether or not it should be allowed. And there were some congressional hearings with Mark Zuckerberg looking, his usual kind of nervous self, in front of a bunch of congressmen. Yeah. But yeah, we have this problem when you have a central authority, is that they can make a decision on a whim, arbitrarily, and then you're in trouble. You've lost your account, or you can no longer speak. And it's a form of censorship. Now, if you don't have a central authority, then that censorship is mitigated or even disappears. So as long as you have enough money to buy a computer or a mobile phone, you can have a Bitcoin account, because it's an open public blockchain that is powering the thing. Whereas there is no guarantee that PayPal will let you have a PayPal account, or that Nordea will let you have a Nordea. Well, actually, there is under the governmental rules, but not if you're a foreigner, not living in Finland. You know, banks generally have a say over whether or not you have an account. It's been a bit of a lightning tour, and I've only been able to touch on stuff sort of on a fairly shallow level. These are the workshop slides, but I'll just skip to the last one to start with. You may want to jot this down. This is my email address. Feel free to send me an email if you want to ask a question or anything like that. I have a YouTube channel where I post an almost daily video, usually talking about blockchain. Sometimes it's about entrepreneurship. Very occasionally it's on sales, which is something I'm not particularly brilliant at, but I'm trying to learn. But there's plenty of blockchain videos there, and they cover things from technical down to the sort of, they're not all technical videos. Some are quite technical, some are moderately, some are more about the sort of social and economic and psychological impacts of blockchain as I see them. And I have a LinkedIn account as well. If you want to connect, I'll accept any connection requests. Okay, so before we move on to the next thing, what should we do now then? Are there any questions? Maybe we should demand that there are some questions.
Question about blockchains and energy consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Is it true that blockchain solutions are getting more effective, constantly more effective, because the energy consumption of blockchain, the Bitcoin is quite huge, and transaction costs are quite big as well.
Yeah.
But there are these new solutions that this problem is just little by little fading away.
Yeah. I think it depends on what the blockchain is trying to achieve. And actually, I think that people propose that you have this sort of burning, basically you're burning energy in order to secure the blockchain network, is the way they put it. I think that, this is just my personal take, I think it's slightly wrong. I think the reason why Bitcoin is so energy intensive is because its value is proportional to the amount of energy burned, which is actually also the case with gold. I think Bitcoin and gold are really, really similar. And Satoshi Nakamoto said that, you know, Bitcoin could be like gold, except that you can email it. So I think the Bitcoin one is a special case. Ethereum is also a big energy hog at the moment, because it also uses proof of work. And they're looking to move towards this proof of stake system. It's a really, really complicated issue. There are people who are arguing that you're just moving from a labor, it's going to sound a bit Marxist here in my terminology, but you're moving from a labor economy to a rent economy. And that by having proof of stake, you're basically, the people who have lots of coins are effectively charging rent on those people who don't. Permissioned is another one. That is very low energy. But it's not really censorship resistant. The best you can do is build a consortium, and then you hope that there are enough different parties that they overrule other parties who try to clamp down. It's kind of a digital reflection of an ongoing problem that we've had in human society for a long, long time. I mean, the whole concept of democratic government is an attempt to solve a similar problem, but in human governance rather than digital governance. So, yeah, it can be solved, I think, for specific systems, but I don't see any solution for Bitcoin ever coming along.
So there's some evolution.
Things are moving along. I guess what I'm trying to say here is, back in 2016, I wrote a little article. It's on my LinkedIn account, and I filed a patent where I thought I found a way that Bitcoin could be less energy intensive. And I think now that it's sort of the value of the system is kind of reflected in the value of the amount of energy that it's using of some kind. It may not be fossil fuels, though, that's the thing, or nuclear power or solar or whatever. It could be, maybe we can find some other thing. There's the same with using shells or squirrel skins for money. The fact is, back in Finland, they did actually use them, didn't they, in some places, or is it just a myth? But the thing is that if you decide that you're going to use squirrel skins as money, you're not going to have a whole bunch of people who are going out there hunting squirrels, skinning them, preparing the skins. And nobody needs 100 million squirrel skins. And that's a lot of energy. Those hunters were all consuming food. So as a primitive society, to spend a fortune on squirrel hunters is crazy. But they were doing it anyway because the economic benefits of having money far outweighed the cost of maintaining the money system. And we have the same with banknotes, making sure that they can't be forged, armored cars, exploding die cases. You look at the amount of energy and money and time we have spent on things that intrinsically have no value, but extrinsically they have immense value to us. So it's kind of, I guess it's a question of, for example, Bitcoin's about value, maybe on another blockchain it's about censorship resistance, and it's kind of the more you spend on it, the better service you get, I guess is a summary.
How about if people move from using one blockchain technology to another? The original one loses value.
Yeah, but there is, of course, first mover advantage as well. There are these things on blockchains called atomic transactions where you can, because you've got assets effectively represented on a blockchain. So like in Bitcoin, there are Bitcoins, and in Ethereum, there's Ether. These are digital tokens on the two blockchain systems. There are mechanisms whereby you can exchange one token on one system for a token on another system called atomic swaps. So that I can see as a way of kind of leapfrogging forward in those things. But I think maybe we get too complicated if we don't do that. Okay. What blockchains should you mine? Okay. I have a policy of not giving any advice as to which blockchain you should use to amass any quantity of cryptocurrency. I talk about cryptocurrency because I think it's important to understand the history of where it comes from and because it's the current best use case. But when it comes to investing in it or mining it, that's speculation, and then we're moving out of my remit and into the arena of guys with pinstripe suits.
Another question? Yeah. Should I try this?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. Well, this known as the 51% attack, which is if you have 51% of the mining power of a proof of work secured blockchain, so we're getting quite specific already there, and then the one with 51% power can take over the network, and they can start excluding transactions. They may even actually be able to rewrite transactions in the past, and this is a problem. But we have an analogy in for example, government, which is that if a Okay, so we have this problem in all sorts of activities in humankind. If you have a company and your board of directors gets taken over, then you may suddenly find yourself ousted as CEO of the company. That's what happened to Steve Jobs. if you are a country and you have a democracy and then a radical party gets a majority and can start pushing through legislation, then suddenly the character of your country may change. And the same thing with blockchain. If you have a proof of work maintained blockchain and somebody comes in and spends a large quantity of money on amassing more hashing power than you, then they can take it over, and it's sort of a fact of life. This could destroy Bitcoin tomorrow if an eccentric billionaire decides to spend all his money on building a huge mining farm in order to totally sabotage the system. So what you try to do is you try to set up the system so that there are incentives that encourage the system to continue running the way that you want it to. And it's not an easy problem to solve. In fact, Bitcoin is quite clever. I'm of half a mind that Nakamoto actually is a time traveler, because he got a whole bunch of stuff right that must have just been guesswork at the start. But what you do is you offer, the aim is to have a governance system, as it's called, the rules that say what happens and what doesn't. You try to set them up in such a way that there's an economic incentive to keep the system running. So that when your miner joins and he has or she has 60 or 70 or 80% of the mining power, if the system's well enough designed, they'll keep it running on the same tracks because it's to their advantage. So, but that's really the only thing that can be offered. Okay.
All right, then.
Further questions? We still have half an hour to go for the lecture, so otherwise we go for the small brainstorming part.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure at least one more of you must have a question. Well, it's varied over time. I mean, there's this sort of joke in the blockchain world that first they ignored it, and it's actually a paraphrase of a quote by Gandhi. First they ignored it, then they laughed at it, then they fought it, and then they're going to lose. That's what Gandhi said about the British in India. It varies from company to company, and there's some contradictions and stuff. But I mean, I would think that if I was running a payment and remittance company, I would be looking at it really seriously, and I would be trying to work out how I can build it into what I do. Because there are some companies, like for example, Western Union is a payment and remittances company, and it's used by a lot of people. For example, people from the Philippines who are working in America and then are trying to send money home end up spending 10% or so of their earnings just on getting that money from the States to the Philippines. And that's a huge chunk. And yet, about 3 weeks ago, somebody sent, I think it was $800 million worth of Bitcoin, and it cost them $3 to do so. Plus, I remember I was trying to pay a lawyer in New York, and I'm here in Finland, and I'm having to wire money. Well, initially they asked if I could send them a check. So they still use checks in the United States, by the way. Do you know? Those little bits of paper you sign and you write a bit of money on it. And then we wired it, and it cost me 80 euros to send $1,000, and it took 4 days. And I sort of pointed out to them that I could have sent them $1,000 worth of Bitcoin, and they would have known that they had it within 10 minutes. And it would have cost me cents. They are a threat to payment and remittances companies. I think that the payment companies are going to have to offer other stuff. And there's this kind of a digital revolution going on in banking in general. We're seeing lots of new banks arising that the old banks are kind of stuck in their way, and there are these new challenger banks coming up. Revolut, Mondo, I think There's like where it's quite remarkable that it's taken our banks this long to actually jump on board digitization or digitalization. And yeah, I don't know what the boards of these companies are thinking, what the CEO is thinking, but from my perspective, it would be a high priority because this is going to be something that you either get on board or you're gone. Okay.
Maybe one more question. So we've been talking quite much about the currency,
Mm-hmm.
but have you been following around, are there any good examples of taking control of your personal data, for example, like medical data or maybe like educational data,
Mm-hmm.
or your educational reports for students? Have you followed around, are there some cool emerging blockchain applications in this area?
Yeah, there's one of the things about blockchain is you can name any area and you'll find a project where somebody's trying to do it. It's a bit like the internet in the late 90s, and it's, on the one hand, it's really great because it means lots of people are thinking about it and there's all sorts of amazing stuff coming up. And you know, for example, about sovereign identity, I know plenty of projects working on that. Data ownership, yeah, I've seen those too. The downside is that you also get this problem that everybody, just back when the internet first sort of started kicking off and after Amazon was actually already up and running, there were people going, oh, the internet, you can sell things on it. I know what, I'm going to sell, and then they pick a random product. I'm going to sell pet food on the internet. Pets.com, how could it go wrong? You know, the internet's a gold mine. And, for those of you who don't know, Pets.com is one of the classic failures of the dot-com boom. Because selling books makes sense on the internet. Selling pet food doesn't. And if you want to know why, you can ask me and I'll explain it to you. And the same is happening in blockchain, is that there's these great properties that it has that make it look like it's going to be a really good solution for a lot of things. But it's very easy to go, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to market sustainable forests on a blockchain. We're going to have a blockchain, and each transaction will represent a tree, and it's going to save the planet, and it's going to be great. I've seen about 8 of those kind of projects, and they're all dire, really bad. And there's a few that people just jump on immediately. Oh, we're going to do loyalty points on a blockchain. It's like, well, everyone, everybody thinks of that one immediately. I don't know what it is, and there's a bunch of them that everybody goes for. And when you look into them, it's kind of like, what property of blockchain are you actually using here for your project? And wouldn't a normal database work better? Or shouldn't you actually go and do something else? Yeah, the data ownership is an interesting one, especially since, for example, countries like Finland are starting to get quite concerned about, you know, I've noticed that the doctors used to look stuff up on the computer, and now they ask you for permission to look it up. And you always say yes, but you know, at least you have the option to say no if you don't want to. So, and actually, I think one thing that is interesting there is there's a thing, it's not directly connected to blockchain, but there's the biggest users of it now. It's something called zero-knowledge proof. It's where it's a cryptographic technique whereby I can prove to you that I know something without telling you what it is. And the usefulness for this in finance is a very clear one, which is there's a problem on the Bitcoin blockchain is that everybody can see your balance. If you use an address to send some Bitcoins to somebody, they can see how many of the rest you've got left, which is risky. You know, you buy a second-hand boat off someone for half a Bitcoin and you send it from your address. If you're not careful about how you do that, the guy who sold you the boat can see that you've got another 150 Bitcoin on there and you're really, really rich, and it might make you a target for crime. Whereas when I send money from my bank account for the same transaction, they can't see my bank account balance. But you can't hide the balance on a blockchain, because otherwise how do you know that I actually have enough to pay for it in the first place? But there is this thing called zero-knowledge proofs, and they allow you to, for example, prove that you have enough balance in your account without actually revealing how much you have. And I think that is interesting in, for example, blockchain and health, because it means that you can reveal things about your health without revealing everything. So you may be able to say, you can prove that I'm trying to think of how to word it. For example, you may have an illness that you don't want your employer to know about, and you're not legally required to, but you also have to, for the insurance purposes, provide a health record or a health report. So you can have these great trade-offs where it's like, okay, I'm keeping my health data private, but I'm giving the insurance company the required information for them to make a decision on what my insurance quote should be without letting them know that I've got a life-threatening disease or, you know, or I'm terminally ill or something like that. Because it's got to be fair on both parts. On the one hand, the insurance company should not be in a situation where they offer you life insurance at a bargain rate, and then it turns out that, you know, you're going to die in 6 months' time. But on the other hand, you should not have to tell them, I've got this disease, because it's private to you. So blockchain plus zero-knowledge proofs could offer these kind of things, and I think they're going to be of great benefit to us.
So, should we do some small discussions still?
Yeah, well, it's really up to you if you want to. I mean, I said I've got the workshop ideas, which we can tackle, or...
I think most of those topics are something that...
Oh, are these the ones that we're
many
going
of you might still continue as a part of the lecture diary, just to explore the concept of blockchain further. But how about if we have some initial discussions already at this point?
Yeah.
We have some 20 minutes
Okay.
to go, just for anyone of you to get more into this thinking about how blockchain works.
Well, if you can come up with a case that you think might be a useful application of blockchain, for example, and then we can have a discussion, and I promise not to be too harsh. Okay?
All right, so maybe do something similar to previous lectures. So once we put some 2-4, consider a use case for blockchain. Hopefully it's something else than the cryptocurrency. So something connected about the perspective of managing your own data, or somewhere where you don't have the education to do, but something just to get you started. And why here is still here, we can maybe give these insights on what you're thinking about, and just to kind of prepare yourself for the potential when you have it. So consider it. Where is it focusing about?
Well, with any luck, you've written down some notes as I was talking about things, features. I mean, Henry just mentioned removal of a broker or middleman or a central party, control over stuff, particularly stuff that is related to you. I mentioned at the beginning as well, ownership. Of course, ownership can mean a lot of different things. Then there's also this idea of tokenization of things, taking a real, or maybe an abstract concept, but now digitizing it in a way that is slightly different. So lots of opportunities.
So maybe take just some 10 to 15 minutes to brainstorm. We'll be also walking around, and then we can briefly go through what the initial ideas you might have. And maybe here you can send us also the slides so that
Yep.
we can share those topics from...
Yeah, sure. You have them in your email, actually. So, yeah.
So let's do a brief discussion without the microphone.
Okay, thanks very much, guys.